Okay, good evening to week 2 of QSM 548 Project Management. Happy to see all of you are back online this evening, and I know Jay has joined us from Asia, I believe. So, again, welcome. Are there any questions on anything we covered last week? Okay.
Professor?
Yeah.
This is Larry Spicer. I have a question on the DQ questions. I was confused. I think when you pressed, there was one for scope creep, and then there was one for something else. So there were like two different questions for the DQ. Okay.
It's a new way of posting that stuff, and I made a mistake. And by the time I caught it, or it was brought to my attention, whichever question you answered is fine.
Okay, good.
We'll deal with it. We'll deal with that, and going forward, I'll make sure. It's an easier way to manage the discussions, but it was the first time I've used the new format, and I realized one of the questions, it actually had two different questions in it as it was brought to my attention.
That's fine. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions, observations? Okay. We're going to get started. So tonight we're going to talk about the planning phase and how this is vital to getting your projects off the ground, managing these projects, and how groups interact as you launch these endeavors. So last week we talked about the first of the 5 foundational process groups, which is initiating. Tonight we're going to talk about the planning and how do we look at all of the key components, all of the variables, and how do we initiate and establish a plan and launch it and get it off the ground. So when we're looking at planning activities, we look at the ways in which we collect all the data and all of the options and all of the plans and those related documents pertaining to not only planning, executing, but monitoring and controlling and closing the project. And this forms the basis of how we establish our plan for the managing whatever project we're engaged in. Now, there's a lot of other pieces to this, and we're going to be interested in the ones that are for lesson 2 tonight in the planning activities. We want to talk about scope, how do we manage risk, how do we assess stakeholders and those particular requirements, and how do we meet those needs while staying on target, mitigating risk, staying within the scope, because one of the challenges at this stage is what we call scope creep, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, and ultimately adhering to our work breakdown structure, WBS, and that schedule. Again, so there's a lot at play here, and for your projects, this is a critical juncture, is looking at how broad your statement of opportunity may be and how you may want to look at the ways in which you can refine it and get it to a manageable aspect of appropriateness while meeting not only the needs of your stakeholders and your champion, but also the criteria for MPB and the academic requirements that NGS has put forth, without making it so large and grandiose that completing it would be challenging at best. So When we're looking at scope management, what's the activity or activities that identify ultimately what is needed to satisfy your constituency? What is in that CRM, that customer requirements matrix, that is of essence of where you need to drive your project? And how do you accomplish that? Well, there's multiple ways of doing that. Interviewing the stakeholder group, the key constituencies. You may want to develop focus groups, create a questionnaire and send that out to various areas and solicit their feedback. You may want to start with some prototypes. Again, pure observation of the environment. And what has evolved out of your CRM in terms of the higher end or the higher focus or the greater value of that CRM. And some of the inputs at this point are your charter, your stakeholder register that we talked about last week, and the various inputs from the techniques and tools that are listed above. And ultimately, it generates the basis of the requirements documentation. What are the necessary requirements for a successful project, and how are you going to manage all of the various components, all of the inputs, the processes, the outputs, and how are you documenting that? How are you going to manage the project based on all of these variables? It's a lot to consider. So when we talk about a requirements document, this is just a small sample of one. So you would name the project, the date it was created. You want to number each of these items, whatever it is, a requirement or description. What category does it fit in? What's its priority? Is it a number one priority, or is it a lesser priority? And what is the criteria to accept this item, and any comments? What you want to look at, especially in large and complex projects, what we refer to as what we call traceability. How do you, are you able to map via documents the steps that are required to ultimately down the road control scope and manage any of the change or the processes that might change as requirements evolve in the life of the project. And this happens quite a bit, especially in significantly large projects where you have multiple constituencies, you have multiple moving parts, and you need to be able to track all of these things so that you can manage these processes and look at how they may impact the requirements throughout the life of the project. And it may also be at the end of the project, or maybe a year or two later, when, say, there's an upgrade or there's a modification that's needed to whatever process that the project created and evolved from. You may want to go back and look at, well, what was the decision process when they decided to make this step in the process or make this change? What was their rationale? What do the documents tell us? And it can be incredibly valuable years later if that change that you're anticipating or expecting, 2, 3 years, even 6 months down the road, post go live or post effective of the establishment of the outcome of the project, and you're looking to make some more modifications at this point. So it's very, very valuable. And, looking at exactly. Looking at requirements for traceability, so you want to look at the number, who submitted it, what's the function, who's signing off. Again, and we're looking at the ways in which, what is the criteria and who is signing off on this. So I want to focus in on how do you manage scope of a project without allowing it to morph into something that becomes so incredible that it's challenging to manage it. So within scope management, you want to determine the what and the who that need to be included, those what's and who's and other areas that should be excluded from the project. What are the constraints? And that could be supply constraints, resource constraints, time constraints, other areas that are going to restrict what you may be able to do in terms of seeking clarity for your requirements for whatever feature, product, or service that you may be looking at creating in this project or improving in this project. Again, macro flowcharts work really well. Additional interviews may be appropriate. And again, looking at the contract, looking at the documentation, reviewing that. Again, what is the value-added activity that will help you be successful in meeting the expectations of the stakeholders, the champion, or your customer. Again, creating an appropriate project charter that clearly delineates and identifies who's responsible for what. What do those requirements documentation look like? And you also have to really be aware at this point, what's the budgetary constraints that are for consideration? What's the financial resources that you have available to yourself? Because one of the challenges with projects, especially those that are large in scope or complex, is if you don't budget appropriately, you may need to go back to the well for additional funding and additional resources. And that can be incredibly challenging. It may even be embarrassing. So you want to really keep an eye on those areas and be appropriate, And if there is the need to reassess, again, is the scope of the project too big? Well, if it's not, then you may need to go back to those champions and sponsors for additional resources. And ultimately, scope documentation is the output of this particular focus area on your projects.
Professor.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just looking at what you were saying. Previously, we had a project. It was for jet engine shipment bags, and we had done all our research and everything, and we had all the financial documentation. But once the vendors or the companies found out what we were doing, they raised the price probably 300%. So that changed everything that we were doing to where we had to go back and search a different vendor.
Yeah, that's a challenge. You didn't have a contract with that vendor for stable pricing then, huh?
No, I guess not. I don't think it was a stable pricing.
Or fixed pricing.
Yeah, because once they found out that we were trying to assess this product again, they rose the price up probably about 300%. A bag that cost, I think it was $8,000. Now they were wanting $35,000 for it.
Yeah, they saw opportunity.
Yeah.
One of the things when you get to a little further down into your projects, you'll hear what they call SIPOC, which is a SIPOC chart, which is suppliers, inputs, outputs, processes, and controls. As you begin to look at projects, you want to identify your resources and find out what is the stability. You raise a great point, Jay. What's the stability in the pricing? Is it for a year, 2 years? Is it less? Is it variable? Is there a volume savings possible? Because it's very difficult when you're trying to be successful and find out that when your suppliers cuts the rug out from under you, as was just clearly in the previous example, going from $8,000 per unit to $35,000 per unit. It's pretty significant. Um,
Yes, sir. Definitely.
were they successful finding a new vendor?
I think we're in the military. We have the assets to make the bag ourselves on base, but because of the contract, and I think we just got out of that contract and made our own bags.
Yeah. So that particular vendor um, put themselves, out of the supply chain business for that particular item because they were greedy.
Yes, they did.
Yeah. And, probably built a little bit of ill will too somewhere along the way.
Yeah, yes. But the thing about the vendor, we still rely on them for other parts. It's just that particular part they tried to rob us basically. So we just eliminated that part of the contract.
Yeah. Again, the government purchasing process is a little different than the private sector purchasing process.
Yes,
Um,
sir.
and, each of them have their pluses and their minuses.
Another question while we're talking about this, like you said, in the government with vendors, we're in the government, in the military, we're bound by contract. So when you go out and start doing research and say, well, this vendor's not working for us, but we can't get out of the contract, so it's not feasible to go look for other vendors.
No, I understand that. But within those contracts, maybe their productivity isn't where you need it to be, and then the only way to look at that is future contracts. But from a supplier perspective, that should mean there's fixed pricing.
Yes, sir.
Most times. Most times.
That'll be something I never thought about, when we start doing our research and collecting data, that I'll see if we can locate and find.
Okay, that's excellent. Anybody else have any other conversation points or thoughts on the topic at this point about scope and projects maybe that you've been part of where scope has been a challenge or caused you to rethink or rework the planning phases of any of the projects you've been involved in? Okay. So what we want to talk a little bit about now is what we call a macro flow chart. And with its scope application, what we need to do is ensure the start and end points are clearly defined and agreed to for the particular project that we're focusing in on. And again, an assessment to determine who's going to be involved, those departments, those teams. What do those processes look like? Where are these folks located? Is it within the same facility, within the same geographic location? Are there other considerations? Are they within the same country, different countries? Time zone considerations and all of those. And again, the real focus in on what's the budgetary and other constraints, what's that look like? And ultimately, when you choose and select the champion, make sure that they have the appropriate authority and the bandwidth to handle the project, along with all the accompanying responsibilities for the scope of the project. So, when I was talking a little earlier about the projects that you are evolving into and developing, As this slide says, in my experience in the last 5 years, teams tend to take on more than is necessarily feasible. So as you look at your projects, is the scope appropriate? What you're looking for is, you may be seeking to make, a huge change in your organization. Better to look at it from a perspective of, hey, maybe this change is a good idea, but let me take it to the point, particularly for this project, from a pilot perspective. So instead of doing a division-wide or a system-wide approach, maybe I want to look at a department level or a smaller bite of this, so that I can work out the bugs and be successful at the pilot level, and then additional ideations will be able to move that forward. But you want to make sure with your champions, sometimes, champions can be very aggressive. And it's, as project managers and as quality folks, it falls on us sometimes to kind of say, okay, sure, Mr. or Miss Champion, we understand that, but it may be appropriate for us to learn on a smaller field and a smaller scale, and if we're going to make any mistakes, to learn and refine what we're doing before we move it out to a larger scale. And again, those are things that you need to negotiate with your champion, along with your lead faculty prior to charter signing. And it's been my experience fairly consistently that the initial problem statements tend to get narrower in scope over the next, as you move towards MPB2. As you discover and you begin to map those opportunities, you may find that there's multiple things that need to be corrected, and you bite one piece of that process as the nexus of your project. So let's talk about in rolling up our sleeves and getting into the planning phase, and we want to look at what we call WBS, work breakdown structure. So once the requirements have been finalized and you have agreement among all parties, and particularly yourself and the champion and your stakeholders, once those things have been determined for or defined for that particular project, then you need to look at, okay, what's the work that needs to be done? So you look at the requirements documentation and your scope statement, and then you begin to build the structure of the WBS and the dictionary, which details the description of work that's to be done, who's to do it, time frame it's to be done in, and what are those resources that are needed to do the work. So decomposition. So let's look at an example here. So what you want to do is get to the lowest level, which is known as an activity or a work package. And this helps to understand the way in which costs can be estimated, the duration of the project, or the steps that are involved, how long will it take, and what are those resources. So for example, we look at we're going to have a party. So we decide we're going to invite less than 20 people. We need to have food and beverages for both kids and adults, and what's our entertainment going to be? So for looking at the invitation process, we need to obtain invitations. We need to send them out. For the food and beverage piece of the activity, we need to go buy the food and prep it. Ultimately, the entertainment piece, we need to hire a DJ band or whatever we might be. But interestingly enough, on the invitations, we need to track the confirmations, because the confirmations will tell you how many people are coming, and ultimately that leads to how much food and beverage you need to purchase. And then under the food prep, it's grill, hot dogs, burgers, 3 side dishes, whatever you land on. So as you can see, conducting a party or hosting a party branches out to at least 3 different levels and takes it in several different directions. Anybody have any questions on that? So now, in this particular example we just had, this is pretty broad. Nowhere do we see procure invitations, write invitations, stamp invitations. We have, procure and send and then track. In this particular example, this particular WBS is a little bit more specific, and they tend to be very graphical. So we're looking at, in the top here, we're looking at the various deliverables of the project. So whatever that first requirement might be. Obtain inventory. Requirement number 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it might be. And what are the functions that are required to support that first requirement? So for example, if we're looking at materials and resources, it may be going out and interviewing vendors and pricing. It may be looking at where we're going to stage that material, et cetera, et cetera. And then underneath that, so for example, function 1.2 has 3 sub-functions, sub-function 1, sub-function 2, and sub-function 3. And again, driving it down from the broad to the specific, the next level has the sub-function 1-2-1 has 3 different processes below it. So as you can see, you start from a broader perspective, you move into a particular identified requirement, break it into its functional pieces, identify. Now each of these functions could have sub-functions and features. The blue dots are just continuation. So this is requirement 1 to requirement N. So you could have requirement 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's a whole bunch of them. Correct, Edgar. It's just continuations. So in other words, in this sample, where it says requirement N, it could be 5. So there could be okay, thanks. Yeah, okay, Matt. Just answer Matthew. Okay. So again, if we look at this particular one, this particular requirement has deliverables. So we number those as well. It has a function in addition to the deliverables or subtasks, which may be contingent on other functions or requirements may be contingent upon those. So as you can see, you flesh it out with great detail. So when you're looking at the features or work packages here at the bottom, one of the things you want to make sure, are they small enough to be appropriate for estimating the time requirements and all of the costs that are associated with that particular component? Is there enough detail? Is the manager and the team feel the appropriate level of detail is satisfied, or it satisfies the need or provides enough information to proceed? Can you assign these packages to a single person or a team who can be accountable for a result. Here's the important part to that. How far down can you get the simplicity of, or the tasks where you can have a team or a person that can be accountable for a result. So for example, project deliverables is a wide spectrum of who would be accountable. Again, requirement one would be multiple people would be accountable. When you get down into here, you know, the features, when you break it down far enough, now you have a level of accountability, you know, due dates, times, and things like that. So, are there sufficient billing time for accounting purposes? So again, develop recommendations for improvement. Are those deliverables clearly focused in on outcomes? So, when we look at planning process and how they are related in terms of a schedule process, so we want to define the activities, which is the work breakdown and milestones. We want to develop the sequence. How are they connected? What's the start, the steps, and the finish? And we do that via diagrams. What are the resource requirements that are needed? How long will it take? And then developing a schedule is, how do you develop a schedule? A lot of schedules can be one way or another. They're built from start to finish, or they're built from finish and they back into the timeline based on when the project needs to be completed. So when we look at a network diagram, we look at the task. Each task is represented by a single box. So we could be starting early, we could finish early, we could code number of task and task name. We may start late, we may finish late, and what's the elapsed time and what's the float. So each box contains important task and schedule information for the overall project. It may not necessarily need to get to this level of detail, but it's shown here so that you can get a greater sense of the concepts of the course. So for example, again, task 1, next step 1.1, again, breaking it out and how they're connected, task 2, task 3, task 4, and task 5, and where are they connected and how do they overlap and how do they maybe connect with each piece. So you place each task on the network, include the task name, the coding, and the elapsed time. So for example, this is 3W, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, 2 weeks, and so forth. Determine and draw the task into dependencies. So Matthew's asking if they can, does it mean they can? Not necessarily. Depends on So it doesn't, Matthew is asking, does it mean they can be completed at the same time? Not necessarily. It depends on the interdependencies. Again, this is when you look at your scope and your project and your timeline. So if task 1 most projects I've been on, most tasks are sequential. There may be some ability to so again, there may be some ability, but a lot of times there are steps in the project. So there may be testing, there may be, you know, whatever it might be. So good question, though. So the elapsed time is the total expected duration of the task. So for the total duration of task 1 is 3 weeks. The total duration of task 2 is 2 weeks. Task 3 is 4 weeks. And it's dependent on, it looks like it's dependent on task 2.1 to move and complete to be successful towards task 3. And again, task 2.2 moves directly to task 4. And then together they all come down to task 5. So again, elapsed time is the total time expected for the duration of the task. Start time is the earliest time the task can start. Early finish is the earliest time a task can finish is the early start time plus the elapsed time. A late start is the latest a task can start without affecting a successor. So it's late finish minus elapsed time. So if the late finish is 8 weeks and it takes 6 weeks to complete, the late start can be 2 weeks after the start date. The latest we could start a project or that particular task without impacting our successor. And again, the late finish is the latest the task can finish without affecting the successor. And again, float talks about how do we impact a particular task without affecting the critical path. Why don't we take a 5-minute break before I get into the next topic. I need to refresh my water here, and we'll be back. And I'll be back. We'll be back in about 3 or 4 minutes. All right, so we'll just take a quick break, and we'll be back in about 3 or 4 minutes. All right, folks. So we're going to start the discussion about sequencing. You know, we take a look at all of the activities in the work break, the work breakdown structure, and the key milestones. We lay out those activities in a sequence which can be worked on, and we establish the dependencies, the precedence diagramming. So for example, we may be looking at finish to start. we may be looking at finish to finish, depending on particular project, start to start, and start to finish. So as we look at the nodes, we see here there's start, there's A, B, C, there's D to C, D to E, F to G, and again, as they move and relate to the finish. So when we look at activity dependencies, for example, so as we look at the start of successor, it depends on a predecessor. For example, here, you can't hang pictures on the wall until the paint on the wall finishes drying. Make sense? And that's a finish to start. So the finish task would be to hang the pictures on the wall, but you can't do that until the previous task is completed. So a finish to finish example could be, you can't, a book cannot be finished until the last chapter is written. Okay? A start-to-start dependency would be, in this example, you can't begin to level concrete until they start pouring it in. And a start-to-finish, very rarely used. Normally it's for the other three dependencies. So when we look at the determination of our dependencies, what's absolutely necessary and required may depend on the physical limitation. Then we have what we call discretionary, which may be based on previous performances or best practices. And then there's external dependencies, could be building codes, government regulations, and the like, policies, whatever else there might be. So when we look at precedence diagramming, we look at early start or early finish versus the various activities in late start, late finish. So the ES is the early start, the EF is the early finish, LS is late start, and LF is late finish. So as we add duration, for example here, the example days for each node. So for example, we've added duration, so number A is 4 days, B is 1 day, C is 5 days. D is 8, E is 3, F is 7, G is 2, H is 1, and ultimately till we get to the finish. So when we're looking at a network diagram, critical path is the longest, or excuse me, the sequence of tasks that takes the longest to complete. That helps to define the duration of the project, determines the end date of the project, so if you're looking at reducing the overall duration, you can't do it without shortening this critical path. So when we look at establishing a critical path, you want to identify the activities that cannot be delayed without delaying the project finish. So one of the critical paths is start plus A plus B plus C. So A plus B plus C plus the finish. So 2 plus 1. So the path duration is 7. Okay. The D to C is 10. and the DEF, start to DEF, is 12. So as we look at the various durations, again, the critical paths are of these durations. So we can't delay these D, E, and F without delaying the overall project. Delaying DC more than identified here. What are the tasks on the critical path? What is the elapsed time of the tasks on the critical path? Items that are dependent to one another on those particular tasks. What are the resources that are being expended or utilized on that particular path? So when we focus in on this, what's the most important part? So changes on critical path will most likely change the end date of the project. It's considered the weakest link of the project. Everything else is dependent upon it. You need to understand the critical path to be able to manage it appropriately. So again, looking at the vital pieces to this are, again, good knowledge, good focus, and if I adjust this, it's going to most likely impact the end time of the project. It may delay the project. So when we're looking at the next, and before I move on, is there any questions on critical path? All right, hearing none, I'll move on to the next piece. So when we look at how do we estimate the activity resource, I'm going to pause there because Matthew has a question. I'm just going to wait for him to type it for me. So Matthew's asking, the three paths are leading to the same result. Are all three necessary for the result? Yes. So let's go back and look at them again. So various nodes to, so this, for example, could be, so for example, the PeopleSoft implementation that we're doing in my hospital, this could be A, B, and C, could be the finance track. D and E could be, say, purchasing. F, G, and H could be the HR piece, but they're all important to get us to the finish line. They're not necessarily, they're not dependent on one another, but an expected outcome or deliverable to meet finish. That's a great question, Jay. Jay's asking, what about my belief is you try to estimate time that will, you know, I tend to, when looking at project, I try to provide enough time and try to overestimate and come in under and deliver ahead of schedule. Make sense? Good questions. So the D, E, and F piece here, the start to finish, that's the critical path because it's the longest of all of them. So in essence, A could start, you know, a little later on in that project and still meet. It could actually start 3 or 4 days later than D and still finish on time. Oops. So back to activity resources. You know, what's the type and the quantity you need? People, material, equipment. What are the challenges? What's the list? Is there a need for any sort of alternative analysis? Published estimates. Are we looking from the bottom up? And how do we estimate the resources that are required? So some of the tools that work towards estimation are the experience of who's on your team, similar previous projects done by those who are doing the task by project by task. There's also what we call, you know, this quantitative estimating. So for example, if you're looking to carpet a room and the room is 20 by 20 and the rate is, the cost is $10 a square foot, so you can estimate it'll be about $4,000. It's a $4,000 price tag, and based on experience, to install a 400 square foot room with carpet takes about 4 hours of labor to finish. So you've estimated that it's $4,000 and it'll take 4 hours. Now the 4 hours could be one man. By 4 hours, it's not very clear. Is it two people 4 hours, or is it four hours? If it was four, you know, I would like to see a little more clarity here, particularly if it impacts the financial piece. So the other way to look at this is using something what we call, with estimates, it's the 3-point. You look at the optimistic, the most likely, and the pessimistic. So if the optimistic is 6 days, the most likely is 8 days, the pessimistic is 10 days. So that gives you a total of 24 days, and you divide it by 3. So most likely, the 3-day, the 8 days needed is what becomes. We may need to weight those as well. You know, the optimistic is the best case. Most likely is more reasonable. Pessimistic is the worst case. So we place an additional value on that. So for example, the optimistic plus 4 times the most likely plus the pessimistic then gives you another way of looking at it if we need to do weighted averages or PERT. So in a project, estimating resources, estimating time, estimating all of that is very important to get you to the resource list that you need for your project. The other piece to this is, mitigating risk or assuming risk or identifying risk. And risk is the probability of failing to meet a goal multiplied by the consequence of that failure. So risk has 3 components. Uncertainty, which is the probability of failure. What may be lost, that part that is associated with failing to meet a deadline. And the time constraints or the time consideration, that horizon of concern. So for example, you look at, from that's listed here, you have a candidate, you're uncertain, no, issue, yes, possible, what's the loss, yes, no, and again, the decision matrix is generate risk. If you continue down this journey, you get to a point where there's a level of risk. If there isn't, then you're fine. So how do you mitigate risk? How do you reduce risk? You adapt a strategy of risk management, particularly in the planning phase, to identify and understand and reduce those potential problems that are on the horizon. Mistake-proof the processes or operations that you're looking at or the activities you're looking at. And provide a method to anticipate issues that may arise during implementation. Identify your potential risks. What might trigger specific risks? What are the mechanisms we can design and implement that will help reduce risk? And how do we detect challenges of risk? And how do we institute countermeasures? So when we look at the risk management process, it's 5 steps. So it's a 5-step process. First of all, we identify risks. What are the events and the impacts? Then we analyze them. What is the impact of the drivers and the probabilities? Then we look at prioritizing and mapping them. What needs to be managed? What's the resolution? Avoidance, transfer, putting in more than one opportunity, mitigation? Do we have to put in contingency reserves? And then how do we look at the way in which those risks are monitored and identified for additional options or opportunities for risk to rear its head? So again, it moves down this structure. And again, the ongoing piece is to check for new risks. And again, identify them, analyze them, prioritize them, look at resolution and monitor risks going forward. So when you're looking at risk mitigation, force field analysis is very important to look at. What are the positives and challenges that you may face, and what's the value or the tendency or the likelihood that they may happen? So for example, the plan here is to upgrade a factory with new manufacturing equipment. So there's the plan. Okay, there's the project. So with education, new products will generate more work. And the value on that is usually it's on a scale of 1 to 5. So there's with the force field analysis, the amount of expectation that more work will be generated is high. It's thought it will be high. On the opposite side is this fear of workers' loss of overtime because of efficiencies isn't as strong as the one across Smith. With education, we raise output volumes that lower unit costs. Again, important. The finance team fears that this new implementation or upgrading will cost more money than maybe it saves or it produces additional revenue. Again, reduces maintenance costs. Workers fear disruption or change, but it's very low. The implementation piece, it can be done in steps. The environmental impact of the new technology. So again, if you look at this, you've got 4, 3, 1, 2. So there's 7, 8, 10. So the power of 10 on this left-hand side versus the value is 8. Again, based on the weighted averages of how you feel this looks. So the tendency is the positive forces for the project are a little bit more vibrant than, say, the challenges against. So, for your team assignment, for your upcoming measure phase, your champion wants your team to develop, administer an employee survey related to your project. The champion wants to approve the questions prior to administrating the survey. The champion also wants to see the final results. What I want you to do is develop a work breakdown structure for your team for the survey of this project. So the requirements are it must have a minimum of 3 levels of work. The first level is provide the survey and analysis, and then you brainstorm the rest of the tasks. It needs to have coding associated with the work breakdown structure, and at least one task could have a detailed work breakdown structure dictionary. And you can use the Excel template that's provided in the course resources. Everybody understand?
Yes.
Okay. So part 2 of the assignment. After constructing the work breakdown structure, make a network diagram using the survey tasks and activities. Sequence them, show the dependents and the relationships they have, and assign a duration for each task. Then you want to indicate the paths and the time that each will take, and then identify the critical path based on that. And then use either the PERT or the 3-point estimation for the duration. Okay? So, next week and going forward, we'll continue working on the planning process. We'll look at communication plans, budgets and cost, purchasing, quality, and the human resource piece. Okay. So are there any questions on the assignment? Okay. I will hold on. That's going to conclude the lecture this evening unless there are questions. Anybody want me to review anything we talked about this evening? Okay. I'm going to remain online. If teams have questions regarding individual assignments or our team assignments, I'll be more than happy to answer those. If you are do not have questions, that's going to conclude the lecture part of this evening. But like I said, I'll remain online if you need any further assistance or want to discuss a topic or any of the deliverables for your team.